The agenda this week looked at how we're taking pictures differently during this pandemic, also examined the climate risks of a thawing permafrost. Take a look.
So I think we've got a variety of different threats that we are looking at with the permafrost. So as you mentioned, there is the potential for an output of carbon, both in the form of methane and CO2, and that could severely punctuate the warming that we're already seeing in the atmosphere if it were to be released. But then you also have threats from infrastructure destruction because the ground below the infrastructure in much of Canada and much of the northern hemisphere has the potential to thaw away. And then in a recent paper that we completed, we also looked at nuclear threats, potential microbial threats, and then any other kind of chemical that's been stored in the northern hemisphere permafrost, which is a considerable amount.
John Holdren, what would you characterize the threat as?
Well, as you noted, Steve, some have characterized permafrost as a time bomb. I think it's more like a wildfire that's already doing damage. We know for sure that it's going to grow, and what we are unable to determine exactly is how fast and how much it's going to grow. But the dangers, as Kimberly has already pointed out, are multiple, and many of them are already occurring. The thawing permafrost is causing subsidence of buildings, damage to pipelines and roads, increased coastal erosion, forcing some indigenous villages actually to need to move, and so on. So it's already happening, and the real question is how much bigger will it get and how fast?
And Tony, what would you add to that?
Well, I think the colleagues have already said it very well, but my typical analogy of permafrost thaw and the impacts of climate change causing that thaw is as a freight train. It's actually quite difficult to get permafrost to move in any given direction. There's a lot of heat that you need to get into the ground to change the state of permafrost. But once it gets going, it's very difficult to stop as well. And certainly the amount of carbon in permafrost, as Kimberly mentioned, and the potential for it to be released into the atmosphere is a serious problem, I think, for everybody in the world. And then locally, for Northerners, as John mentioned, we've got the problems of infrastructure, collapse and changes. And then for the rest of Canada or in the US, we have the issue of what the cost might be to maintain that infrastructure during a thawing phase. And that comes back to taxpayers. So we have the local issue, we have the global issue, and we have the kind of the national issues, and all of those apply to the future.
John, just before we get to those questions, I'd like some better understanding of why there is, in fact, so much carbon trapped in the permafrost. How did that happen?
What has happened is over the millennia, we have had cycles of glaciation and then interglacial warmer periods. And what has happened is in the warmer periods, we have a lot of plant growth. Some of that plant growth ends up sequestered in the soil. And before it can all be metabolized by bacteria and released as carbon dioxide or methane to the atmosphere, the subsequent freezing cycle embeds it in permafrost. And this has happened so often that, as I think has already been noted, in some places the permafrost is hundreds of feet thick and contains an immense amount of material that has been frozen and therefore protected from decomposition by bacteria.
Has there been a change in the ways that you capture memories through photography pre-pandemic compared to post-pandemic?
Absolutely. First and foremost, especially since I am a professional photographer, there used to be so many more opportunities to take photos of my family and my friends and my loved ones with my camera. I definitely find that because I'm at home more often and for so long, especially with all of the different lockdowns, I'm taking so many more photos on my phone than I actually was with my professional gear. And on top of that, I, as an individual, am definitely taking less because I'm not necessarily getting up and getting dressed and going out and doing all the same things that we were pre-pandemic. So there's a little bit of like less motivation to want to take those photos of yourselves and more of an effort.
Marissa, how about you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, pre-pandemic, I was always taking photos of, myself, my friends. I was studying abroad at the time, so there was a lot that I wanted to capture, a lot that I wanted to remember. And when the pandemic hit, I just didn't have the same drive to capture photos and to capture memories because it wasn't exactly something I wanted to remember. But as the pandemic continued on, I realized it was going to be much longer than I initially thought, and I noticed that there was the absence of photos in my photo library, and then I said to myself, maybe I should continue to capture photos. Maybe it's important to document this moment, and continue to make memories, even in spite of the pandemic.
Dallas, have things changed for you?
Yes, most certainly. I would say the starkest contrast I noticed on a personal level, because I actually had my second child during the first week of the pandemic. So the way that I documented her arrival at home and her social life in her earliest days was very different. I found I actually had to manufacture experiences and outings, most of which were just going outside to the park, so that she would have memories and feel that I did document her newborn days. Whereas my son, who was born in 2017, he was out socializing and meeting people right away. So we have all those documents. So I find on a personal level, I definitely am like almost manufacturing these experiences and making a conscious effort, as Jenny said, to really force myself to take more photos from my own life. And for my clientele, it certainly changed as well.
So that child of yours, I presume, is coming up to her second birthday very shortly?
That's right, March 24th.
March 24th. And the pictures, I guess, from the first couple of years of her life are completely different from the pictures from the first couple of years of your son's life, I'm guessing. Is that right?
Entirely. My son is in pictures of him being held by family and friends, for example, and doing indoor activities. And my daughter, it's all just us at home or family walks or being in the park at a distance from friends. So I think there's a visual document of the stark differences in the early days, for sure.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.